In 1967, at the absolute height of his cinematic fame, Elvis Presley was paid $100,000 to serenade a basset hound. The dog, meant to be an enchanted prince, stared back with blank, mournful eyes as the king of rock and roll sang, the moment a masterpiece of pure, soul-crushing absurdity. But what if this wasn't just another bad career move in a decade filled with them? What if this was a meticulously engineered breaking point in the slow, psychological dismantling of the most dangerous man in music? Was the goal not just to make him safe for mass consumption, but to make him hollow? Before the gilded cage of Hollywood, there was a fire. It was 1954. 1955. The name Elvis Presley was not a brand. It was a tremor. A shockwave that rattled the floorboards of a repressed, monochrome America. He wasn't just singing songs. He was unleashing a primal energy that the establishment had spent decades trying to chain down. He was pure, untamed rebellion, wrapped in a pink Cadillac and a sneer that promised a world of delicious trouble. He was a cultural atom bomb, and in the shadows, a former carny with a shrewd eye and a heart full of cold calculation saw not a revolution, but a gold mine. Colonel Tom Parker didn't hear music. He heard the clatter of a cash register. He didn't see an artist. He saw a product. A beautiful, dangerous thing that needed to be sanded down, polished, and packaged for the widest possible audience. The first step was to get him on screen, to trap that lightning in a bottle. The strategy was simple. Leverage the rebellion to get through the door, then slowly, methodically, extinguish the flames that made it burn. Hollywood was the perfect tool, a dream factory that specialized in manufacturing illusions and, when necessary, dismantling realities. It was a place where a king could be turned into a court jester, one multi-picture deal at a time. The public would pay to see the inferno, but the colonel and the studio heads would ensure they only ever felt a carefully managed, perfectly safe warmth. It began before the first movie was even released. His 1956 screen test for producer Hal Wallace was a revelation. The executives saw it. The untamed charisma, the raw, almost violent magnetism that poured through the lens. They knew, instantly, that they had a star. But Wallace's first memo to the studio was not one of celebration. It was a warning. It spoke of containing the energy, of channeling the persona, of finding stories that would soften the edges and make him palatable. The plan to neuter the king was drafted before he ever signed a contract. In the beginning, the artist still fought for air. In Jailhouse Rock, you can see it, a flash of genuine menace in his eyes, a coiled anger that felt real, a performance that crackled with the very danger they were trying to suppress. In King Creole, working with a serious director, he delivered a performance of bruised, smoldering depth. He proved he could act. He proved he was more than a haircut and a swivel of the hips. He showed them the artist inside the icon, and that was his greatest mistake. He showed them the soul they needed to conquer. Then came the army. 2 years, a government-mandated interruption that served as the perfect chrysalis for his transformation. The rebellious rocker was shipped overseas, and the man who returned was different, subtly, but irrevocably. The sneer was softer, the eyes less defiant. He had served his country. He had been made safe. He was now a patriot, a good boy. The colonel couldn't have planned it better. The wild animal had been domesticated by Uncle Sam himself, and now it was ready for its permanent cage. The 1960s began with Blue Hawaii. It was the blueprint for the poison. A beautiful, exotic location, a handful of pretty co-stars who asked for nothing, a plot so thin it was transparent, and a soundtrack of a dozen or more forgettable, commercially viable songs. The movie was a colossal success, and with its success, the steel door of the trap slammed shut and the key was thrown away. The formula had been found, a low-risk, high-reward assembly line that could churn out 3 Elvis pictures a year. The California sun that streamed through the giant soundstage doors felt different from the Memphis sun. It was a dry, sterile heat, a manufactured warmth from Klieg lights that baked the soul and offered no comfort. He would arrive each morning to a world built of plywood and plaster, a kingdom of make-believe where he was the king, but only of the artifice. He was surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone, a living, breathing man moving through a 2-dimensional world painted just for him. He made 31 feature films. Most of them were the same movie. Each one took another piece of his soul. The most insidious part of the poison was the music itself. He had once sung songs that tore open the heart of a generation, anthems of lust and liberation. Now he was contractually obligated to sing about clam bakes, yoga, and pockets full of rainbows. He privately despised the material. His friends, the Memphis Mafia, would later recall how he'd physically recoil when hearing the demos for songs like Old MacDonald or There's Number Room to Rumba in a Sports Car. He would call the music shit in the privacy of his Graceland sanctuary, his fists clenched in impotent rage. But on the set, the smile was switched on. In the recording studio, the golden voice was summoned to give life to lyrics that were an insult to his very being. The contract was ironclad, a labyrinth of clauses and financial penalties designed by the Colonel to make escape impossible. He was trapped by the golden handcuffs of his own unprecedented success. The more money the movies made, the deeper the prison became. Each box office smash another bar on the window of his cell. His life became a strange, hermetically sealed bubble. He would leave the fake world of the soundstage and retreat to a rented mansion in Beverly Hills, a fortress against a world he was no longer a part of. He was surrounded by his boys, his loyal court of jesters and bodyguards, who created a buffer between him and reality. They were his friends, his family, but they were also on the payroll. Their job was to keep the king happy, to shield him from the encroaching disillusionment, to tell him that the movie he just made wasn't so bad, that the songs were fun. They were his companions in isolation, but they were also the gatekeepers of his gilded cage. They watched as the boredom set in, a creeping, existential dread that Elvis fought off with lavish spending, late-night spiritual searching, and an ever-increasing pharmacopoeia of pills to help him sleep, to wake him up, to help him simply get through another day of pretending. The poison of the movies was slow, but it required an antidote. And that antidote, prescribed by Hollywood doctors, was its own kind of venom. By the mid-1960s, the films had descended into self-parody. They were no longer just formulaic. They were surreal in their creative bankruptcy. In Harem Scarum, he was a kidnapped movie star in a fictional Middle Eastern country, forced to use karate on inept assassins. In Clambake, he was a millionaire oil heir pretending to be a poor water ski instructor. The plots were nonsensical, the scripts written as if by people who had never heard a human conversation. This was the nadir. This was where the psychological toll became undeniable, etched onto his increasingly weary face. The fire in his eyes, once an inferno, was now a pilot light, flickering weakly against a storm of apathy. He would walk through scenes with a visible disinterest. His body was present, but his soul was a million miles away, back in Memphis, back on a real stage, anywhere but here. The boredom was a physical entity, a weight he carried on his shoulders through every pointless scene and every ridiculous song. And then, in February of 1964, the world changed again. 4 young men from Liverpool landed in America and reignited the very rebellion Elvis had been forced to abandon. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Doors. They were writing their own music, speaking to their generation, pushing boundaries. Music was becoming dangerous again. It was becoming art again, and Elvis was forced to watch from the sidelines of his Hollywood prison. He saw it happening. He knew he was being left behind, a relic in a world he had helped create. He was a lion, and he was being forced to perform in a flea circus while a new generation of predators roamed the wild. The desire to break free became a desperate, gnawing hunger. He wanted to tour. He wanted to record a real album, with real musicians, singing songs with meaning. He went to the Colonel, not as a king, but as a beggar. He pleaded for his artistic freedom. The Colonel's response was not a negotiation. It was an execution. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply opened his ledger books and calmly, coldly, laid out the financial architecture of Elvis's prison. He explained the millions of dollars in liability for breaking the studio contracts, the network of obligations and penalties that would trigger a financial avalanche, burying Elvis in debt and lawsuits for the rest of his life. It was a threat delivered with the quiet, chilling finality of a death sentence. The breaking point came during the filming of Double Trouble in 1966. The script was abysmal, the songs were a joke, and the daily routine of manufactured fun had become an exercise in pure agony. One afternoon, between takes of a scene that required him to dodge cartoonish spies, something inside him snapped. He walked off the set, went to his sprawling trailer, and locked the door. He refused to come out. It wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't a fit of rock and roll ego. The members of his entourage who stood outside the door heard no rage, no shouting. They heard something far more terrifying. They heard the sound of a man quietly weeping, a profound, soul-crushing sorrow from a man who had finally realized the truth of his situation. After an hour, he let one of his oldest friends inside. The story goes that he was sitting in the dark, his face buried in his hands, and he whispered the words that defined his gilded cage. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice broken. "This isn't me. I don't know who I am anymore." But the machine doesn't stop for a man's soul to heal. The next day, He was back on set, delivering his lines, singing his silly songs, hitting his marks. But something fundamental had shifted. The breakdown in the trailer wasn't the end of a chapter. It was the birth of a secret war. A war fought not against the studios, but for the very essence of his own identity. For if he wasn't the smiling, guitar-strumming cutout from the movie posters, who was he? Was there anything left? This existential crisis became a spiritual quest, and it began with, of all people, his hairdresser. Larry Geller was more than the man who sculpted the famous pompadour. He was a spiritual seeker himself, and he saw the profound emptiness in the king's eyes. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered a lifeline. He handed Elvis a book. It wasn't a script or a tabloid. It was a book on esoteric philosophy. For Elvis, it was like a key, turning in a lock he didn't even know existed. Suddenly, the sterile Hollywood mansions became secret sanctuaries of learning. While the world saw Elvis in Easy Come, Easy Go, playing a Navy frogman who discovers pirate treasure, the real Elvis was up all night, devouring books on Hindu gurus, Christian mystics, and the nature of consciousness. He wasn't just reading. He was studying, underlining passages, filling margins with notes, desperately searching for the man he'd lost somewhere between the gold records and the box office receipts. His conversations changed. He would corner his entourage, not to joke or boast, but to ask them, "What do you think is our purpose here? What happens after we die?" The Memphis Mafia, these good old boys from Tennessee, would just stare back, bewildered. They were paid to protect his body, not to debate the transmigration of his soul. To them, this was just a weird phase, another one of Elvis's eccentricities. But to Colonel Parker, it was something far more dangerous. The Colonel didn't deal in souls. He dealt in percentages. He had meticulously crafted the Elvis Presley brand, a clean-cut, God-fearing, all-American boy who sang harmless songs and always got the girl. This new Elvis, the philosopher king, the seeker of cosmic truths, was a terrifying liability. A product you can't control is a product you can't sell. And the Colonel's response was swift and brutal. He began a campaign of psychological warfare. He started referring to Larry Geller as the guru with a sneer. He'd mock Elvis in front of the others, holding up one of his books and asking, "You really believe this nutty stuff, son?" He sowed seeds of paranoia, telling the Memphis Mafia that Geller was a charlatan, trying to brainwash Elvis and steal his money. He was isolating the one person who was offering Elvis a way out of the darkness. The conflict came to a head on Christmas Day, 1966. A day that should have been about peace became a day of spiritual execution. The Colonel conspired with Elvis's own father, Vernon, a man who shared the Colonel's simple, transactional view of the world. They confronted Elvis at his Graceland home. There was no discussion. It was an ultimatum. They told him his career was in jeopardy, that he was being led astray by dangerous ideas and a weirdo hairdresser. They told him he had to choose this strange new path, or the life, the fame, the fortune, everything they had built. They told him to get rid of the books, all of them. Legend has it they made him burn them, a bonfire of his own salvation. Whether in a literal fire or a symbolic one, the message was clear. Your soul is not your own. It belongs to the brand. It belongs to us. Elvis, ever the loyal son, ever the man desperate for his father's approval, capitulated. He sent Larry Geller away. He locked his searching mind back in its box, and he stepped back into the gilded cage, now more aware than ever of the bars. But you can't unlearn something so profound. You can't unsee the possibility of a bigger world. The Colonel had won the battle, but the war for Elvis's soul had just entered a new, colder phase. The fire for truth had been banked, but its embers still glowed, waiting for a breath of air to reignite them. The movies got worse. The isolation deepened. In Stay Away, Joe, he played a Navajo rodeo rider. In Live a Little, Love a Little, he had a talking dog. It was a creative abyss. He was a ghost haunting his own career, a sleepwalker going through the motions. The prescription pills were no longer just a tool to cope. They were a necessity to numb the pain of this profound betrayal, the betrayal of his own burgeoning spirit. And it was in this moment of absolute despair, with his spiritual lifeline cut and his artistic integrity in tatters, that the Colonel played his trump card, a move designed to cement his control and give the public a story they could understand, a story to distract from the rot setting in behind the scenes. The story was a wedding. On May 1st, 1967, Elvis married Priscilla Beaulieu in a Las Vegas ceremony that lasted a mere 8 minutes. It was less a sacrament and more a press conference. The Colonel had arranged it all. He saw Priscilla not as a partner for Elvis, but as a stabilizing asset, a wife, a future family. These were anchors that would tie Elvis to a conventional life, making him more predictable, more manageable. For Elvis, was it love? Or was it the next scene in a script he had no power to rewrite? A desperate grasp for something real in a world of make-believe? Priscilla herself was a young woman who had been groomed for this role since she was a teenager. Another beautiful figure placed inside the king's cage with him. Was she a fellow prisoner? Or a warden in a velvet dress? The truth, as always, was far more complicated. Their marriage did bring moments of genuine happiness, a temporary reprieve from the crushing loneliness. And 9 months to the day later, their daughter, Lisa Marie, was born. Fatherhood changed him. It gave him a purpose beyond the hollow pursuit of fame. It reawakened the questions that the colonel had tried to extinguish. Holding his daughter, looking into a life that was just beginning, how could he not think about the meaning of it all? The birth of his daughter became the catalyst for the Second Rebellion. The embers of his spiritual quest began to glow again. This time, his desire for authenticity wasn't just for himself. It was for her. What kind of man did he want her to see? The cartoon character from the movies? Or the man he was desperately trying to become? The hunger to perform, to feel the electricity of a live audience, to sing songs that mattered, returned with a vengeance. It was no longer a request. It was a primal need. At the same time, the world of television was changing. Lavish, one-man musical specials were becoming huge events. Frank Sinatra had done one. Barbra Streisand had done one. They were prestigious, artistically credible. This was the opening Elvis needed. A television special. It was a way to reach millions of people, to bypass the terrible movie scripts and remind them of who he really was, without having to break the studio contracts and incur the colonel's financial wrath. He went to the colonel with the idea. To his shock, the colonel agreed almost immediately. But of course, there was a catch. There was always a catch. The colonel saw the special not as a chance for artistic rebirth, but as a quick, lucrative cash-in. His vision was appallingly, predictably awful. Colonel Parker's grand idea for the comeback of the King of Rock and Roll was a Christmas special. He envisioned Elvis, surrounded by fake snow and tinsel, singing a dozen Christmas carols, and ending with a wholesome, silent night. It was a vision so horrifically misjudged, so profoundly tone-deaf, that it threatened to be the final, humiliating nail in the coffin of his credibility. This was the moment of truth. This was the line in the sand. For years, he had deferred, he had obeyed, he had taken the bad advice, and cashed the big checks. But the thought of standing in a Christmas sweater, singing, "Here Comes Santa Claus," while his contemporaries were setting the world on fire with songs about revolution and change, something inside him finally broke free from its chains. This time, when he said no, it wasn't a whisper in a locked trailer. It was a roar. A battle began. A behind-the-scenes war for control of the television special. A war for the soul of Elvis Presley. On one side was the colonel and his sponsor, the Singer Sewing Machine Company, armed with contracts and a vision of a safe, family-friendly holiday show. On the other side was Elvis, and a new, unlikely ally, a brash, young television director named Steve Binder. Binder was part of the new Hollywood. He didn't care about the old movies. He saw the smoldering frustration in Elvis, the caged animal desperate to be let loose. When Elvis quietly confessed his fears, his hopes, his desire to do something that mattered, Binder didn't laugh. He listened, and he said the words Elvis had been waiting a decade to hear. "Then let's do it. Let's show them who you really are." They began to plot in secret. While the colonel was busy negotiating the placement of the Singer logo, Elvis and Binder were crafting a completely different show. One that would be raw, dangerous, and real. Binder's idea was revolutionary in its simplicity. He wanted to strip away the artifice, the sets, the costumes, and put Elvis back in his natural habitat, a small stage, a few feet from a live audience, with his original bandmates. Just a man, a guitar, and the music. He wanted to recreate the famous sit-down jam sessions from Elvis's early days. Unrehearsed, spontaneous, electric. But to do that, Elvis would have to do more than just defy the colonel. He would have to face his own deepest fear. He hadn't performed in front of a live audience in over 7 years. The man who had once commanded stadiums was now terrified of walking onto a small stage. The years of sterile movie-making had destroyed his confidence. What if he wasn't good anymore? What if the magic was gone? The night of the first taping arrived. The stage was set up like a small boxing ring, surrounded on all sides by the audience. Intimate, unforgiving. There was nowhere to hide. Backstage, Elvis was paralyzed with stage fright. He was drenched in sweat, convinced he couldn't go on. The years of being a joke, a product, had convinced him that he was a fraud. Steve Binder and his friends tried to reassure him, but nothing worked. Finally, his old friend and guitarist Scotty Moore looked him in the eye and said something simple. "Just go out there and do what you do, Elvis. Just be you." It was that simple phrase, "be you," the very thing he had been fighting for, that finally pushed him through the curtain. He walks to the center of the stage, straps on his guitar, and for a long moment he just looks at the crowd, a nervous smile playing on his lips. Then he hits a chord, and the sound that comes out is not the sound of a movie star. It is the sound of thunder. It's the sound of rock and roll, resurrected from the dead. In that moment, he wasn't playing a role. It was pure, concentrated lightning in a bottle. Every sneer, every karate kick, every drop of sweat was an act of defiance against the Colonel, against the bad movies, against the man they had tried to turn him into. He sang Heartbreak Hotel, Jailhouse Rock, Loudy Miss Claudie, not as nostalgia, but as a visceral reclaiming of his own legacy. He wasn't just singing songs. He was setting himself on fire. The audience was witnessing a resurrection. But behind the scenes, a different drama was unfolding. The Colonel, watching from the control booth, was horrified. This wasn't his Christmas special. This was raw, sexual, and dangerous. This was the old Elvis, the very man he had worked so hard to tame and sanitize. He saw his control, and his multi-million-dollar deal, slipping through his fingers. He had been outmaneuvered. The special also needed a big, show-stopping closing number. The network and the sponsor, still clinging to the idea of a Christmas show, had commissioned a schmaltzy new Christmas song for him to sing at the end. Elvis hated it. It represented everything he was fighting against. Once again, he and Binder conspired. They wanted a song with a message, something that spoke to the turbulent times of 1968, a year of assassinations and social upheaval. They found a song called If I Can Dream, a passionate plea for peace and understanding, inspired directly by the words of Martin Luther King Jr. It was a gospel-infused anthem, miles away from the frivolous pop he'd been forced to record for years. The Colonel forbade him from singing it. He said it was not an Elvis-type song. He threatened to pull the plug. This was the final battle. Elvis, emboldened by his triumphant stage performance, stood his ground. He recorded the song anyway. In the studio, he reportedly fell to his knees, singing with such raw, emotional power that the musicians and engineers were left in tears. He poured all his spiritual searching, his pain, his hope for a better world, and his own personal plea for freedom into that one performance. He was no longer just the king of rock and roll. He was an artist, fighting for his voice. When the special, simply titled Elvis, aired on December 3, 1968, America wasn't prepared. They sat down expecting sanitized holiday cheer from a forgotten star. What they got was a cultural atom bomb. The black leather sit-down segments were a revelation, a primal scream that echoed through a generation. But it was the finale that ascended from performance into something spiritual. There was Elvis, standing alone in a pristine white suit, a stark contrast to the black leather rebellion. He was no longer a rocker, he was a prophet. He sang, If I Can Dream. It wasn't a song, it was a sermon, a prayer ripped from the very soul of a turbulent nation. Every note was a raw nerve, a testament to his own struggle, and a plea for a world on the brink. The sanitized product was gone. The artist, in full command of his power and his purpose, had been reborn in a trial by fire. The special became the highest-rated television event of the season. Overnight, Elvis Presley was no longer a joke. He was the most vital, dangerous, and relevant performer on the planet. The Colonel, despite his initial fury, was a pragmatist. He saw the ratings, the record sales that followed, and the flood of offers. He may have lost the battle for the show's soul, but he quickly adapted to capitalize on the victory. The '68 comeback special was more than a career move. It was a jailbreak. It was the last time Elvis would ever truly fight for his own artistic freedom and win so decisively. It propelled him into the final, legendary chapter of his life. The Las Vegas years, the white jumpsuits, the global satellite concerts. It was the moment he reminded the world, and more importantly, himself, that beneath the costumes and the caricature, there was a fire that could never truly be extinguished. He had stared into the abyss of his own obsolescence, and, for one brilliant, shining moment, he had won. This was the moment Elvis Presley chose to be more than a legend. He chose to be an artist. And his story is filled with these battles for the soul of the man behind the myth. To see more of those stories, to truly understand the king, make sure you subscribe to Forever_Elvis_.